Welcome to the Safety Pro Podcast, where we help you manage workplace safety one episode at a time. And now, your very own Safety Pro, Blaine J. Hoffman.
Welcome back to another episode of the Safety Pro Podcast. This episode, I want to tackle meaningful employee involvement. This is a hotly contested and debated topic. A lot of folks that claim to have meaningful employee involvement actually only have, a handful of workers that attend meetings and then leave. And we claim that that's an employee involvement when, what we want to get to is meaningful employee involvement as defined by employees actually having a say in the decision-making process when it comes to safety and health. They are actually making decisions, okay? Showing up to a safety committee meeting, attending, being talked to, and then leaving is not meaningful employee involvement. So the question is, are employees actually driving the change? They're not passengers, they're drivers along the way, along this journey, okay? So let me back up. I'm going to go way back. I'm going to talk about something or somebody that has shed some insight onto this. And this is somebody who a lot of production managers, quality control, business leaders will be able to identify with this individual. And I'll also break it down for small, medium-sized companies as well. But I want to talk about William Edwards Deming. So Deming was an American engineer, a statistician. He was even a professor. He wrote books. He did lectures. And he was in his, the lion's share of his work is known as a management consultant. He actually helped inspire and give rise to Japan's post-World War II economic dominance. So, he's no joke, okay? I don't want to spend a lot of time on Deming's background, except to say that his work is still shaping industry today. So here's but one example and how it can relate to this topic of employee involvement. Now, it wasn't until 1981, 82, I believe it was 81, when Ford Motor Company became the first American or one of the first American corporations to get help from Deming. Now, Ford's sales, they weren't the best. They were heading south, okay, in the tank. From 79 to about 82, Ford had posted, I think, somewhere around upwards of $3 billion in losses. And they had just appointed a corporate quality director, Larry Moore, at the time. And he was tasked with getting in touch with Deming and to have him come over and help jumpstart this quality movement at Ford. Okay, so Deming first, right out of the gate, okay, this is classic, questioned the company's culture and the way its managers operated. Now, this was a surprise to Ford and the folks at the company because Deming did not talk about quality, but instead he addressed Ford's management. He advised them that, it was management's actions that are responsible for about 85% of all the problems in developing better cars. So by taking Deming's advice and continued work with them, in 1986, Ford came out with a profitable line of cars, the Taurus and Sable line, and that was the first time they'd done that in years. Now, by then, Ford had become the most profitable American auto company. And for the first time since, I think somewhere back in the 20s, its earnings had actually exceeded those of General Motors. Now, Ford had come to lead the American automobile industry in improvements in quality and even organizational improvements. And in years to come, their earnings confirmed that this was a success, not just a fluke, not a one-time, one-off thing. They had a great line of cars and that was it. It was actually, a transformational change within their culture. So for its earnings to to continue to exceed GM and Chrysler's was validation, okay? It was one of the only U.S. automakers that did not take part in the taxpayer-funded bailout in recent years as well. So, much of Ford's early success in the 80s and that culture change, is still sort of carrying through today. Now, in a letter to Auto Week magazine, this is something interesting I found, so I'll just go ahead and read it. Donald Peterson, then the Ford chairman, said, quote, "We are moving towards building a quality culture at Ford, and the many changes that have been taking place here have their roots directly in Deming's teachings." So more confirmation, okay? So several of Deming's points address specifically employee participation issues. Things like constancy of purpose or drive out fear, breaking down barriers or eliminating exhortations. He has basically 14 key points to his approach that you can look up. Just look up Deming and look up these 14 points. But these points are particularly appropriate as the underpinning of an effective safety and health management system. That's why I bring Deming into this. Because in large organizations, especially organizations that are struggling with safety, but yet they're managing to tackle quality culture change and improvements and drive, work from the floor and engage in teaming with engineering and maintenance with operators. Well, so too can those tools be used for safety. It's no different. It's exactly the same. So I bring up Deming in that context, all right? When it comes to meaningful employee involvement, strict emphasis needs to be given to participation by these non-supervisory workers because they're often the closest to the process. They're often the closest to the hazards. They have the most intimate knowledge of machines, tools, operations, and those hazards. Okay, not always, but sometimes years of bad habits and not focusing on safety by management can lead to workers being unable to see certain hazards or appreciate certain hazards. I often will come up to an operator and point to something and say, have you ever questioned why that's not guarded? And they'll look at me and go, it's been like that for 35 years. Why do I need a guard on it? I've never shoved my hand in there. What do you think, I'm an idiot? Well, okay, so they just have never been told by leadership that, it isn't that we don't trust you won't shove your hand in that machine, but there are some minimum requirements, some sort of, whether you want to call them, value add or necessary requirements that we have to comply with. In this case, a federal regulation, and that's all it is. Okay. Once you do that, the operator shrugs and continues on doing their work. Putting a guard on something usually, I say usually, has no impact on their productivity. But yet when you walk up and you point to that and ask them, their knowledge of that, if they push back and don't really appreciate that as being a hazard, I still go back to, well, that's a leadership issue, not pointing that out and saying, whether they realize it or not, this is something that's unacceptable to us. So, you still can't get around going to the floor, taking it to these workers and getting their input and their buy-in, okay? So, that's meaningful employee involvement. They should be along, not just a passenger on this journey, but they're going to have to take the wheel every once in a while and actually drive this change. Okay, so, this is why, it takes active leadership support to get this going. Okay, so non-supervisory employees are a valuable but often overlooked resource for improving safety and health. You can't just relegate this to a safety director or a safety manager. Employers should use multiple strategies of employee involvement. So, later on here, I'm going to go over some examples, but basically, you want to avoid these barriers to participation that may negatively impact the overall effectiveness of engaging employees. So you want to use a variety of approaches because, what works for a couple of workers, some other workers may not take to that type of engagement. They may want to get involved in different ways. So a multi-faceted approach is key. So in the end, the intent of any employee involvement is to encourage employees to get involved in several ways or do several things. One, to have meaningful involvement in the structure, operation, and pursuit of the objectives of the safety and health management system. So basically what they want to be, you want to get them involved in how we set up and operate and pursue improvements with safety, meaning doing audits, how often we do audits, any type of policies that we come up with, they should be involved in that. Also, they should be involved in identifying tasks, hazards, and risks, and possible control measures within reason. Sometimes workers will say, and managers for that matter, will say, we don't need that. Always check the need for a protective measure or corrective control measure against minimum OSHA requirements. So if it's a requirement, then talking about it's over. It's just a matter of how we're going to comply, those options. So they can certainly be involved in selecting the most feasible control measure that gets you in compliance. Also, they should be able to participate in planning, evaluating, and implementing any of those control measures. So get them involved in, getting them involved in fixing, guards, selecting PPE, training, get them involved in training other workers as well. Do a train the trainer with some of these, peer leaders. It's a great way to get employees involved in, again, the structure, operation, and pursuit of the objectives of the safety and health management system, okay? What are we after here? And are they driving part of the way? The organization has to establish a process to ensure effective participation in the safety and health management system by its employees at all levels of the organization, including those working closest to the hazards. Here are some ways to do that. A, provide employees with the tools, the time, and the resources, including training, that are necessary to participate at a minimum in planning, implementing, and evaluating corrective actions and preventative actions in the safety program. Okay? So give them the tools, time, and resources needed to participate in planning, implementing, and evaluating, including corrective actions and preventative actions, various aspects of the safety program. B, provide employees with timely access to information that's relevant to the safety and health management system. Copies of policies, procedures, OSHA regulations and rules, things like that. Just make sure that they have reasonable access to this information so they can educate themselves and understand what is needed. And C, identify and remove obstacles or barriers to participation. This is management's role. Okay, if you need a recap on leadership support, go ahead and listen to the previous podcast episode and where I talked about what does leadership support for safety mean. But basically, identify and remove obstacles or barriers to participation. A great way to identify some of these is to ask the employees. Ask them, what stops you from getting involved? If somebody were to come up and ask you, hey, would you mind being on this safety committee? What would you say? And if the answer would be no, why? And what can we do to kind of remove some of those barriers? Effective employee participation should include a role in activities ranging from, incident investigations, procedures development, health and safety related audits, training development, job safety analysis, the use of occupational risk management processes, even some workers' comp type of issues like following up with injured workers that are on light duty and to see how they're doing, not necessarily getting into some of the cases because of privacy concerns and issues, but certainly having somebody return to work on light duty and having them team with somebody else on the floor, that buddy system really helps boost morale and gets people back to regular duty a lot faster than just sitting at home on light duty until they go back to the doctor. Okay, studies have shown that transitional work and return to work programs does work. They do work. They get injured workers back to work quicker. And one of the best ways to do that and to increase morale is to pair them with another peer that can help them along. Okay. So basically, all the aspects of the planning process and implementation process of your safety management system, you should have levels of meaningful employee involvement along the way. Okay, one common mechanism for employee participation is the safety committee. And as I said at the beginning when I opened up this episode, the safety committee is not a group of workers that sit there and get talked to. Okay, safety committee formation and function in U.S. workplaces can be subject to the National Labor Relations Act. Okay, so keep that in mind if you have some sort of collective bargaining agreement or if you already have a contract set up that establishes a safety committee among union workers. But otherwise, other than that, non-union and non-supervisory personnel, get a group of employees together that actually have goals established and actually go out and achieve those goals. They participate in the progress and implementation of the safety and health management system. They don't just show up and the safety manager or department manager talks to them and tells them, here's what happened last month and here's what we did about it. Any questions? Thank you. Get back to work. That's not a committee. That's barely a meeting. I would even argue it's not even a meeting. So, so that's key. So, any individual that is volunteering, to be on this should be allowed to do so within reason. Okay, so that's meaningful employee involvement on a safety committee. They have a role on the committee and they have expectations to meet certain performance standards of being on that committee, doing certain audits, participating in investigations, actually providing feedback and recommendations, going out between meeting cycles and talking to a certain number of people on the floor and getting feedback and bringing that to the meeting and talking about it. That's meaningful employee involvement with a safety committee, okay? Relevant information should include any, logging safety concerns or issues. So anybody reporting hazards, the committee can review these and determine what the best approach to mitigating that hazard. Any safety program or project objectives and implementation of plans that the safety and health management system produces, they can be involved in that, okay? Results of incident investigations and corrective actions as a result of incident investigations. I'm not talking about employee discipline here. I'm talking about conducting a true root cause analysis of our systems or processes after an incident occurs, and you've identified key things that can be put into place or changes that need to be made to prevent an incident like that from occurring again in the future. Then employees can be involved in implementing those changes. So that's key as well, incident investigations. Also, monitoring data. So industrial hygiene or being involved in, helping take readings, go over the monitoring results, things like that. They can be involved in that. Ergonomics evaluations. Employees are great for getting them involved in ergonomics evaluations, especially demonstrating how you do certain jobs and having an IH or an ergo assessor, rather, do that with the hourly employees. That's key. That's a great way to get employees involved, okay? Obviously, keeping records can be kind of touchy, like injury and illness records. So you want to make sure that we don't have too much exposure to some privacy records for employees, but certainly helping gather some data post-incident or post-injury accident report is a great way for employees to get involved in the safety program. In some circumstances, incident investigations or audits could be performed under legal privilege, and so you might be limited on how you can distribute that information. So just be aware of that. Now, given the importance of employee participation, as well as accurate injury and illness data, employees should always be encouraged to report injuries, illnesses, accidents, incidents, deficiencies, property damage, and concerns, all of that stuff, okay? It should just be a normal thing that as soon as something happens or almost happened, they drop what they're doing and fill out the necessary reports or notify somebody. That should be just a part of your culture. And using non-supervisory personnel to kind of drive that culture is key. This can't be something that a safety manager comes up and says, hey, you have to report. Our policy says you got to report that. You have to make sure that leadership can sell the value of capturing that data. the reason why we need that reported. It isn't to fix blame, it's to fix our systems. Okay, so that's, again, a leadership role in driving this culture, this meaningful employee involvement. Properly designed programs can be used to promote employee participation in these activities. So start with how you're going to promote reporting of incidents, what policies drive this. If you're going to have somebody self-report a near miss that, I'm going to report to my supervisor a near miss that I was involved in, and, maybe I was in a hurry, maybe I wasn't paying attention, but is there amnesty involved if I self-report and nothing really happened, but we honestly approach it from a systems improvement standpoint? Have a policy for that. So it's very important that, you have these well-designed policies and programs in place before you go out and hit the floor with this stuff. Same thing for incentive programs. Another great way to get employees involved. Incentive programs, drug testing programs, disciplinary mechanisms, of course, they all have to be carefully designed and implemented to ensure that the employees aren't discouraged from or participate for the right reasons in the safety and health management systems. So incentive programs can't be too valuable. They can't counteract what you're trying to achieve there. I'm going to do another episode on incentive programs because, those things, you can go all across the board with incentive programs, and there are some best practices to follow. I will have an episode dedicated to that. So let's real quick talk about barriers to employee involvement in the safety and health management system. So effectively engaging workers to actively participate requires thoughtful planning and implementation of processes and policies that they build this atmosphere of trust. Okay? Again, a leadership job. So let's talk about barriers to employee involvement that leaders can avoid. Big one right here. Disregarding the fact that all injuries and illness are a result from exposure to hazards. So once you leadership acknowledges that all injuries or illnesses are a direct result of an exposure to a recognized hazard, then they can wrap their arms around this and get their mind around this whole concept of all injuries are preventable. Because to accept any of them is to give yourself a pass from investigating any of them at all. So also another point, perception by employees that management is just primarily interested in disciplining unsafe acts without actually addressing the hazards or root causes. So anytime you don't change the workplace, but you modify the worker through discipline, but yet the machine and the operations standards and the setups, that they're all the same, then you really probably missed something, okay? Personnel actions such as promotions, compensations, or demotions, or disciplines, even reassignments that are administered in such a way as to reduce or undermine the commitment to safety could be a barrier to participation as well. Treating worker behavior as though it is a root or underlying cause rather than identifying hazards or system-related causes can be a barrier to participation. Also, not implementing hazard recognition and control measures or ignoring the hierarchy of controls that we've already talked about in a previous episode. That is a huge barrier because employees aren't going to participate when management can't even get a simple guard on a machine, but yet they want me to participate in this other thing over here. And, I'm not going to do that until they can fix my machine. So ignoring those other things can lead to or be a barrier to employee participation. So administering a post-accident program like drug testing in a way that discourages injury reporting. Selling your post-incident drug testing and drug and alcohol testing is important. The way you sell it is important. You just make sure it's not a barrier to participation, okay? Not implementing hazard recognition or control measures is probably going to be your biggest one that I mentioned. That's huge. I see this a lot. I would go into a facility and I'll have managers, leaders scratching their heads saying, hey, I wish we can get more employees involved. And I'll say, really? Because I just walked the floor and I can point to probably half a dozen examples where employees have been asking for safety and health with their tooling, equipment, and they're basically, at least their perception, which is their reality and drives their behaviors, the culture. The perception is that they're being ignored, but yet you're angry because or upset because they won't participate in this committee. So that's going to be your biggest tip, if anything, to take away from this. So not implementing hazard recognition and control measures and ignoring the hierarchy of controls is related to that. So keep that in mind. Blaming employees with undue emphasis on discipline instead of implementing system changes. Another one. How about an uneven accountability? That's a big, focusing only on the line or hourly workers and not addressing the behavior of supervisors, like managers that walk around with their sleeves rolled up when you have a long sleeve rule in the plant, or not wearing safety glasses, things like that. But yet hourly workers wouldn't be able to get away with that. So it's got to be fair and equitable, okay? And the employee perception that production takes precedent over their personal safety and health, that's a huge driver. Look, we can all agree that the employee's only reason for being there is to produce a good or a service that our customers are going to buy, the profit, right? That's the business. Okay, everyone gets that. Safety is a tool you use to get that done. And when employees look at something that is hazardous or could be potentially hazardous, and that gets ignored, but yet I can go out to the floor and jump all over an employee's case 5 times a day because they're not going fast enough because they're trying to work around and avoid these hazards, they see that a certain way, and that can be a problem. So employee perception that production takes precedent over their personal safety and health is a huge barrier to employee participation. I threw a lot at you on this episode. It's a quick, I think we're going to be shy of 30 minutes here on this one. But I wanted to get it out of the way because everything from this point on, you're going to have to come back and recall this, how leaders are committed. Is this supported by leadership? Did we pave the way for everything else that's coming after this properly? Do we have meaningful employee involvement? And if not, are we the barrier? Is leadership the barrier? And we kind of need to come to terms with that. So stay tuned. Keep going to the blog and looking at the articles I post there. Ask any questions on there. Check it out on Facebook as well. We have a Facebook page. So keep this in mind. What barriers do you have to employee involvement? And are leaders committed, truly committed to taking down these barriers to employee involvement and encouraging workers to get involved in the safety process? Because the bottom line is, one safety manager or area manager or production manager can't be safe and can't make safety for everybody else. It takes a group effort and a fundamental culture change in some of these organizations, and you need meaningful employee involvement to make that happen. So let me know what you think. I look forward to hearing your comments, and until next time, be safe.
Thanks for listening to the Safety Pro Podcast. Be sure to visit www.consulthoffman.com for articles and information about safety services. To have Blaine read your question on the show, email him at customerservice@consulthoffman.com. Be sure to have 2 F's and 2 N's on Hoffman. Until next time, be safe.